Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your lunch. Oh, helpful, I suppose. Now, I have been criticised at the last event for being very negative about the future of inheritance tax and how it was all doom and gloom. So I've asked this time to be a wee bit more upbeat. But I have to be honest with you, I'm really feeling my age at the moment. One, I've got a sore hip. Secondly, when I was discussing one of the case studies that I was going to go over today, someone that said, oh yeah, I'm going to talk about Ken Dodd. And they said, Ken who? So, anyway, let's hope this goes. Now, the problem we always have, there's lots of good things to talk about, but they're all stuck in a log jam with Brexit. So it was actually quite interesting. I was thinking 40 years of James Hay, what's happened over a 40-year period? And then at the time of the spring budget, and it's surprising, there was a policy paper issued by the Treasury or by HMRC, and no one really picked up on it. And because there was nothing really in the spring budget to look at, I actually took the time to read all 95 pages or whatever it was contained within it. And like a lot of these things, it turned out to be a real gem and something that was worth reading it. So I want to share some of the outcomes with that. I also want to look at how the revenue know what you're doing. And it's very much a case of, is Big Brother watching you? And the answer is, they bloody well are. So is the tax planning noose tightening? And the simple answer to that is, yes, it is. Are there advantages there for advisors? The answer, there is. Can I ask you a question? And I'm a bit concerned, in case no one has come across this. How many of you have clients who have gone into a tax avoidance scheme? Hands up. There's a few, actually quite a few of you. That's a relief. So, what you've got to look at is, I say, this policy paper when it came out was quite interesting. It was headed up, Tackling Tax Avoidance, Evasion and Further Forms of Non-Compliance. All these titles are pretty riveting, but the good thing was they gave us a definition, or an updated definition, of what the revenue means by tax evasion. And the good news, it hasn't changed. Tax evasion, it's when you just do not tell the revenue information, which they need to in order to assess your tax. You hide that information, and it's illegal. Always has been the case, not something you want to get involved in. Now, tax avoidance, on the other hand, well, that's where you bend and you twist the rules so that actually, although the Parliament intended legislation to go down a certain way, you think, oh, there's a couple of wee loopholes, or if we do this layer and this transaction, then we come back to where we began again, but we're left in a position where we don't have to pay tax. And the problem with tax avoidance schemes is it takes the revenue a long time, first of all, to get the details of the scheme, and then challenge the scheme, and then to go through the court processes. And it is not uncommon, if you go up to something like the Supreme Court, they take about 10 years in order to get a decision. And we're going to look at Rangers Football Club as an example of how these things can stretch out. So tax avoidance, and the other thing that's quite interesting, 30 years ago, tax avoidance was quite acceptable. In fact, if you go back to 1989, other than the year that James Hay introduced its first SIP, Ken Dodd was prosecuted not for tax avoidance, but for tax evasion. He had suitcases stuffed full of money in the loft. The country was riveted to the trial because Ken Dodd was literally one-liners. I think one of his lines was, yes, when income tax was first introduced, it was £2. It was 2 pence in the pound, and I thought it still was. So he had all this riveting thing, and it was hilarious to watch. This man in court, potential of going to jail, and what they ended up deciding was, one, he was a fantasist, and he was eccentric, and therefore it was okay to evade tax, and he was acquitted. So much so, he still even got a knighthood. Okay, it was probably delayed quite a period of time, but it was one of these things. And his defence said, you may come across an accountant who is a comedian, but you'll never come across a comedian who is an accountant. So anyway, Doddy got off with it, quite a remarkable. And then they go on about non-compliance, tax non-compliance. What do they mean by that? Well, it includes tax evasion and tax avoidance, but all just carelessness and errors. And it's amazing how much just people making mistakes in their tax return leads to a major tax loss. And we'll look at that in a wee bit more detail. So what did this paper tell us? Well, it was going back to 2010. So by the time it was issued, it's really looking at between 2010 and 2018. So over an 8-year period, what has happened looking at the issues of tax avoidance, evasion, and non-compliance. Now, what the revenue said is they'd introduced 100 legislative measures over an 8-year period. That's quite a lot of legislation. They also very generously increased funding, or put an additional £2 billion of funding into HMRC. Now, what the revenue reckon is alongside their compliance department and the additional money that was invested, they've managed to take in an additional £200 billion of tax that otherwise wouldn't have been paid. So that's a very healthy return on £2 billion. What is quite different is they're increasing the criminal charges for tax fraud to over 1,000 a year criminal cases. Now, that was unheard of. And again, if we go back and look historically, 2 years before Ken Dodd, we had Lester Piggott. Now, the shock in the country when Lester Piggott went to jail for tax evasion, the country was in shock because someone had actually physically gone to jail. Someone well known, a celebrity, a sportsman, had gone to jail because of his tax avoidance. Now, it was a 3-year jail sentence. He actually only served 1 year and 1 day. And you'll have all heard the story that he actually had agreed a settlement with the revenue. And part of that is you have to sign the declaration saying that you promise that all the information you've given is correct, you've given all the details of your finances, and he actually issued a cheque from an account he hadn't disclosed. So the revenue just said, bye-bye, you're going to jail. That's it. Lester Piggott denies that. He says that never, ever happened, but I think he just might have felt he was a bit of an arse. But anyway, moving on. But out of that, there's been 4,009 years of custodial sentences. So you evade tax, there's a very strong possibility, one, you'll be criminally prosecuted, and secondly, you may go to jail. Now, HMRC have an obsession about the tax gap, and we're about the only country obsessed about it. In a lot of countries, probably they can't work out even potentially what it could be, but the revenue have a view that they estimate what tax they think they should receive, they look at the amount of tax they actually got, and there's always a shortfall. Now, for 2016-17, that was £33.4 billion. And what I love about the revenue in these papers, they try and make it as upbeat as possible. And they said it was a near record low. Not it was a record low, it was a near record low. And the funny thing is, I'm always going £33.4 billion. I'm sure the tax gap is always about £33 billion there. So I actually look back, and what we do find, actually in 2010-11, it was 32 billion, and it constantly is round about that figure. Where they can say there's a near record low is that it's actually 5% of total tax take, as opposed to 10 years ago, it was 6.7%. So they are reducing that tax gap as a percentage of the overall tax. So we'll give them credit for that. So this 33.4 billion, how's it made up? Britain is a country of small businesses. They're the biggest employers, biggest generator of income. 13.7 billion of the tax gap is made up from small businesses. Then it's large businesses at 7 billion, criminals at 5.4 billion, and then it's mid-sized businesses, 3.9 billion, and individuals are actually there at the bottom at 3.4 billion. So the biggest problem is with smaller businesses. Now this I don't quite understand, but when the revenue give the figures, they talk about income tax and national insurance, which I get, because they're the top two of the top three tax, but they've added in capital gains tax as well. But 13.5 billion of the tax gap comes from income tax and national insurance. Capital gains tax will make up only a tiny percentage of that. VAT's 11.7 billion, and we'll look at the steps the revenue are taking to get around that. Corporation tax, 3.5 billion. Excise duty, all the illegal cigarettes and booze that comes into the country, 3.1 billion. And other taxes, 1.6. What is interesting, if you look at it by behaviour, the biggest cause of the tax gap is a failure to take reasonable care in errors. So when people are completing their tax returns, they're getting figures the wrong way around, they're not adding up correctly. And although it's the amounts involved probably in each person's tax return are very, very small, when you multiply it by the number of taxpayers, it becomes a very, very big figure. And people with VAT, they lose invoices, all sorts of things. So things just don't get done properly. Criminal attacks, well, that's something that it's not just a case of the revenue, but the law enforcement and so on all have to look at and try and take steps. Legal interpretation is the one that I like best of all. It's just simply the revenue think one thing, and I think something completely different. And we've got to try and agree who's right. So that normally leads to litigation. Non-payment. In other words, people just don't pay their tax. They've got a demand, they don't pay it. You've got to take recovery action. You can make them bankrupt, fair enough. Or some of them just leave the country, just no longer at this address. So that's a fairly big issue. The hidden economy is always a problem. And avoidance at 1.7 billion. In fact, the hidden economy, my local Chinese restaurant got raided about 3 weeks ago. It was the talk of the town. We had immigration, police, HMRC representatives, had the works. So these things do happen. So avoidance actually, if you look at it, is fairly low down the pecking order, but it's still 1.7 billion pounds. And if you add that to evasion, then suddenly you're talking about a far bigger figure. Does anyone remember this gentleman? Hector, the tax inspector. Now, for all he was first introduced to us in 1985, you still find him on press coverage when the Pinks and all that are doing something on the revenue, they always stick Hector in. Now, the reason they get rid of Hector, because he was too white, he was too middle class, and I'm trying to think what the third one was. Too male. So that represents me. But the actual problem was he was too nice. He was this bubbly tax inspector. Please get your tax return in, or we're coming after you. And the problem is the revenue then to the revenue now has changed quite considerably on their attitudes and what they're prepared to do. And that's a biggie. So what steps have they taken in the last 8 years? Well, the list is fairly substantial. I've just picked a few highlight ones that mainly focus on individuals or small businesses. So they're making tax digital. And you've noticed in your own personal, if you usually do tax return, more and more information has been already put into your tax return, like my P11D benefits, my P60 benefits and all that are already in my tax return. And that one day all your interest will be in, all your dividends will be in, and it'll be up to you to check that these figures are correct. So from a personal perspective, that's happening. For small businesses, they're actually trialling it for people who are self-employed and landlords. And what they have to do is actually buy software, do their accounts and everything through it, and it actually more or less does their tax, sends the information to HMRC electronically. And the idea is to cut down in errors, so people will put their receipts in at the time, keep an ongoing record, it's good. But it's actually in place for VAT. From the 1st of April this year, VAT, where you're VAT registered and you're over the VAT threshold, then you have to put your VAT returns and all that in digitally. So you actually have to have bought software that will do your VAT returns and do all the record keeping and so on. So digital is on its way, and we've got to be aware that that's just something that's going to progress. And the main aim of that is to cut down on all these errors. So the revenue is investing a lot of money in it, but if you think it's 9.6 billion a year that's been lost or something like that, then if they can cut that down significantly, it's money well spent. The Fraud Investigation Service, set up in 2016. Over the last 3 years, the number of criminal investigations has increased sixfold. So again, you're getting this lack of tolerance for people who get involved. 100 years of custodial sentences relating to arrangements promoted and marketed as tax avoidance schemes. So not necessarily those who have, these are avoidance schemes, not evasion. But because of the way they've been marketed and promoted, they're actually going to prosecute. And they've got a 90% success rate since 2015-16 in the cases that have gone to litigation. So they're very, very successful when it comes to frauds. Large businesses. This astounded me. At any one time, half of the UK's largest businesses are under investigation. Massive. They actually will have a full-time HMRC employee based in their head offices and so on, going through their books, looking at what they're doing, monitoring what they're doing. And I thought that was unbelievable. But that is it, and it's money well spent. They secured $9 billion in additional tax revenues in 2017-18. And again, 86% success rate when it's gone into litigation. So if you're going to court against the revenue, the odds are stacked against you that you'll win if they decide they're going to prosecute. So what else have we got? We've got the general anti-abuse rules. Now, again, as we said, how long it took for if someone was in an avoidance scheme to go through the legal process. So what the legislation said, what they set up in the legislation was a general anti-abuse rule. And it's a panel. There's 3 people on the panel, independent people. And what they will do is the revenue will go to them and show them schemes that people are using and ask them to determine whether or not they're avoidance schemes. Now, the thing with it is they call it the double reasonableness test. And what they say is, cannot reasonably be regarded as a reasonable course of action. So instead of this day of having to go through the legislation and try and prove it, you just have to step back and go, why did you do these 2 or 3 steps just to come back to where you began? The only reason you did it was to avoid tax. That is sufficient for the general anti-abuse rules to kick in. Now, they were introduced in 2013, a year later for national insurance, but they weren't actually first used till 2017. And I think it's just the time to get the panels, to get them up to what they can and cannot do and get it set up. But as you can see, of all 10 opinions that came out in 2018-19, all went in favour with HMRC. It impacted on 2,300 taxpayers, and the penalties up to 60% if you get caught in one of these arrangements. Now that's quite hefty. The news is, though, is that the individuals or the people involved in those schemes can go through the normal appeals process. They're not prevented from doing it. This is just an initial step for the revenue to say, this scheme is an avoidance scheme and we don't think it works. End of story. But you can go through all the normal appeals process. Now, what the revenue also induced in 2014 was accelerated payment notices. Any of your clients experienced those? Yes. And literally all they do is they write to you and say, we don't think your tax is right. We want you to pay this amount in the next 90 days. Thank you very much. And it doesn't even matter if the scheme that you're in, if the outcome of the challenge has been known, they can send you an accelerated notice payment if they think you're in one of these arrangements. And as they say, since it's come into play, £8.7 billion it's generated, and the revenue's got 100% success rate in defending any judicial review challenges that have been made against the regime. So again, it speeds up that whole process. Not only have they speeded up the process in making a decision, but they've speeded up the process as to when they can get the money. At the same time as accelerated payment notices, they also introduced follower notices. And what happens if a scheme or arrangement is defeated, and normally they just take one scheme, go through the process, then if you are in that scheme, or if you're in a scheme that is similar, they will send you a follower notice, literally just saying is, we've now proven this scheme doesn't work. You now have to correct your tax returns and send them in. Do it. If you're really unlucky, they'll send you an accelerated payment notice at the same time, just saying, well, just pay up within the 90 days as well, please. And then you can carry on doing your challenges and all that if you want to go down that route. Now, the disclosure of tax avoidance schemes, DOTAS. Well, DOTAS has been with us for quite some considerable time. For VAT, it came in 2004. For other main schemes or taxes, 2006. Now, what the disclosure of tax anti-avoidance schemes was that if you were put together or created a tax avoidance scheme, or if you were promoting it, you have to get it registered with the revenue. And as well as registering it with the revenue, you have to provide them with all the legal opinions, your arguments as to why it works. So they've got all this lovely inside information, the revenue. They can either change the legislation to make sure it doesn't work, or it gives them the information if they decide they're going to go through the appeals process on it. So it puts them in a very, very strong position. Now, the hallmarks, and if we don't have time to go into this, you'll be quite grateful just after your lunch. But the requirements for the DOTAS and when you had to register, there was various hallmarks, and they're very, very widely worded. But in 2016, they stuck in 2 more. One was employment income provided through third parties. So that was to get through all the disguised remuneration schemes that were out there. But the one that had the biggest impact in financial services was they said that where there was financial products. that helped tax avoidance. So all of a sudden you're thinking going, what about discounted gift schemes for inheritance tax? Are they still able to work? Because at the end of the day, they are a financial product, or they're based on a financial product in order to avoid inheritance tax. The good news is the Revenue clarified that discounted gift schemes, loan schemes, all these sorts of arrangements, traditional insurance-based products as such are still okay. So that was good news. Now, what they have done is they've really now started to challenge the people who are promoting these schemes, because quite often they are very oversold. But if you're promoting one of these schemes, then since 2017, you can be fined up to 100% of the fees that you actually got. So in other words, whatever costs and research you've got to pay all the money you received as fees back as a penalty. So, you know, it's no longer attractive for people to take the risk of promoting these schemes or arrangements. So, as I say, they're really stamping down hard on it. Now, disguised remuneration. The biggest offenders used to be football clubs. It led to the demise of Rangers Football Club because they were paying a lot of their top players, a lot of their actually backroom staff. So what they were doing, they were being paid a small salary. There was an employee benefit trust set up, which initially the legislation allowed full tax relief for Rangers when they put money into it. They were lending money, which the players didn't pay tax and national insurance on it. They may have had to pay a charge on the value of the loan as a benefit in kind, but generally speaking, they paid very little tax and national insurance because they were getting this loan. Now, the Revenue's always said that disguised remuneration schemes didn't work. In 2011, when Rangers was going through the worst of its problems, all the Celtic fans turned up with Hector the tax inspector masks on. I can remember it. So, so disguised remuneration was this big issue. But there was an awful lot of people in those schemes who hadn't paid any tax. And in 2017, the Revenue eventually won in the Supreme Court that disguised remuneration schemes didn't work. So what they did decide to do was that anyone who was in any of these arrangements and still had a loan outstanding from 6 April 1999, they had three options. You can either repay the loan before the 5th of April 2019, you can agree a settlement with the Revenue, but you had to register to that before the 30th of September 2018. And what that allowed you to do was they would do an assessment for each year. So you'd get the benefits of things like personal allowance, you'd pay the tax at the rates in the year that you received the money. And if you didn't do any of those, then what you would do is you'd be hit with one massive tax bill for tax and national insurance just based on the total of income tax in the one tax year. So far more costly. And the Revenue reckon that will raise £1 billion. Now, the problem with loan relationship rules is we always assume it is football players. They were probably the biggest beneficiaries of the arrangement. But like all these arrangements, people start to market and promote them. And unfortunately, an awful lot of people who are agency staff, like supply teachers, nurses and so on, they were actually encouraged to go into these arrangements. So people in relatively low earnings were encouraged to go into these to save tax. And if they can't afford to pay them back, then it could face bankruptcy because there's a 30% or up to a 30% penalty to be added to that as well. Now, the Loan Charge Action Group, who a group of these people have got together to say how unfair it was, say that someone on £30,000 per annum, being remunerated 5 years through a disguised remuneration scheme, could face a tax and national insurance bill of any guesses? How much? £42,324. So you think of that tax bill landing on your doorstep and you're earning 30 grand a year. What's the possibilities of repaying it? And there's a lot of discussion about that as to what should happen. Now, just in March there, Hyrax Resourcing Limited, they also did the K2 scheme, which Jimmy Carr was involved in. And that again shows you a difference. Ken Dodd, hero of the nation, beat the tax man. Jimmy Carr, humiliated in the press, ended up settling without going through the court process because public opinion was against him. Now, Hyrax Resourcing, what they did do was they encouraged people to leave their job, usually with the encouragement of their employer, because the employer then doesn't have to pay national insurance, employer national insurance. And what would happen is that the company would, or in this case it was a trust, would take on these people, rehire them out to their original employer, the trust would pay them minimum wage, and then they'd be remunerated the rest of the time through loans, so no tax and national insurance, or very little national tax and national insurance on it. And the intention was, through various loopholes, the rights to the repayment of the loan would go off to an offshore trust and they'd never have to repay the loan. Now, what the revenue has done is, first of all, they didn't register it under the DOTA scheme. So what Hyrax resourcing have to do is they have to give all the 1,180 high earners that were in the scheme, revenue reckons they'll get £40 million back. And Hyrax, if they don't go to it, they could fit a penalty of £6 million plus an additional £5,000 in charges per day for not disclosing the information. So, fairly brutal. Now, the OECD, as part of their arrangement to sort of cut down in tax evasion, we now have 100 jurisdictions who are all members of the OECD who exchange information. In 2017, offshore financial, it was 1.3 million UK taxpayers, their offshore financial interests were reported to HMRC. In 2018, 5.6 million offshore bank accounts were reported to HMRC. And what has caught a lot of controversy is the revenue have allowed people lots of time to come back and to challenge, or given a lot of opportunities for people to admit they've got money hidden offshore. What they have said now is they can now go back 12 years and do assessments over 12 years. So what a change in 8 years. The global exchange of financial information didn't exist in 2010, does now. Comprehensive penalties for tax evasion didn't exist then, do now. And corporate criminally liable for failing to prevent the facilitation of tax evasion. So directors and companies and so on can now be prosecuted. So they don't work. The revenue are closing in on them. But how do the revenue know what you're doing? Has anyone heard of the Connect system? It is the Super Snooper. And what it is, computer cost £100 million, designed by a defence company, BAE Systems. It came in 2010, but its functionality was more limited then. It's really hit full functionality since 2017. Collects data, information from everywhere. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail. It then stores all that data, and then it analyses it. And the technique they refer to as social network analysis. And it just goes through completely unrelated information and then tries to cross-match it. And what it can do is it can detect what would otherwise be invisible relationships or connections between people and assets and so on. And what the analysts do, when they go down and look at it, they get a spider's web with all the links and connections, and they can tell by the shape of the spider's web whether there's a strong possibility tax avoidance is taking place. For an individual to do it, it would be humanly impossible almost to do it. These machines can go through individuals in seconds, and they can put profiles of individuals who they think may be avoiding tax. 80% of all investigations are now generated through Connect. The Code of Practice 9, anyone received one of those? What I love about the revenue, it's an invitation to make disclosure, because they won't tell you what they think you've done, because what the terminology they use is the clean cough. So you go in front of someone, they interrogate you, you don't know why you're there, and next minute you're admitting to stuff that they weren't aware of. So they call it the clean cough. Next, artificial intelligence, where there'll be no analysts needed because Connect will do it all automatically, and it'll write out, and there'll be very little human interaction. So where does all this data come from? Visa and MasterCard transactions and other payment card systems. Now, they say it's anonymised, but they know how much restaurants are taking in, how many shops are taking in, people doing online trading, how much they're taking in, all that information. Land registry, how many properties do they own? How often do they change properties? Company's house, are you a director in a company? How much were you remunerated from that company? The company accounts provide a lot of information. Which of your many houses are you resident in and paying council tax on? Who else is paying council tax in your other residencies? Are you declaring rental income? DVLA, how many cars do you own? What kind of car do you own? How many times did you change your car? Are you trading in motor vehicles? You start to get it. UK and overseas bank accounts. As we've seen, all that information's there. They've also got all their own internal tax documents, tax returns, VAT registration, council tax, earnings, P45s, P60s, P11D, benefits. Also goes through eBay, Gumtree, all these online trading systems, and wheedles people out. Are they trading, or are they just selling their old car? What are they up to? They've also got the electoral roll of your many houses that you own. Which one are you actually registered? Which one are you paying council tax on? Social media, Twitter and Facebook. How can you afford to go on such a lovely holiday when your taxable income for the year was £15,000? There you are, with you, the wife and the kids, all in Barbados for a fortnight, telling everybody how great it is. Web browsing and email records. Providers now have to keep your email records and your browsing history for 12 months. And the revenue can access that. And then there's third-party information. They had to spell it at doctors, private hospitals and medical insurance. They looked at their records and they found that certain consultants and so on hadn't been paying tax and income they'd received for doing private work. Gas Safe Register, they asked for all the details that they have on record. They arrested 5 gas engineers. Airline tickets, where are you going? Why you've been in Panama twice in the last 6 months? Is there a reason for that? Estate agents, credit agencies, the list just goes on and on and on. Prior to that, they really relied on informers, disgruntled employees, people, someone in a divorce. Oh, my husband's got all this money offshore. Someone who's next door. Oh, they're renting out rooms. They're doing bed and breakfast. Mystery shoppers, they'll turn up to your premises. They will take photographs of your menu. They'll take photographs of who's coming in and out your restaurant. They will then tally it up and they'll go and have a look and see if what goes through your books for that day is what they estimate that someone would have had. They'll even send people in, have a meal, and see if the meal comes up in your books for that day. And they'll photograph it all as well. Fake figures, the chi-squared or Benford's law. The figure 1, when people fix figures, they tend to try and even them out so there's the same number of 4s, 2s, 1s, all that sort of stuff. But the first figure, for example, for a restaurant usually is 1, and it appears 30% of the time. And this software system can work out for various businesses and so on what should be a balanced approach for your bookkeeping. They can raid your property, media and TV. My big fat gypsy wedding, 4 prosecutions. Because it had all these people who didn't earn a bean but could afford to spend tens of thousands of pounds in their daughter's wedding. Fear and guilt. You see all these things and people think, they're coming to get me, they're coming to get me. And they just crack and they just go to the revenue and admit it. So, and this is part of advertising prosecutions. And this is the one I liked. This was someone completely off the radar. Little old lady lived off the state pension. She had no tax history whatsoever. She stayed in a property worth millions of pounds. And Connects managed to link up there, just things weren't quite right. And then they discovered that she was actually operating a brothel and she was earning £100,000 a year tax-free. So it just shows you what these systems can do. So there's 2 messages to walk away from this. If your clients have been tempted or encouraged to move into a tax avoiding arrangement, these are the things you can tell them. It won't succeed. The revenue are more than likely are likely to be well aware. If they take you to court, they're probably going to win, and they're not scared to do it. It can prove very costly, because we've seen with penalties up to 60%, interest, legal fees, the actual cost of the arrangement itself. Tax avoidance can be very, very costly. And not only that, once you're on their list as on the naughty step, they'll continue to keep an eye out for you. Loss of reputation, because they do publish the names. If anyone thinks it's a aid for 25,000 or over, they will put your details on the internet, what you've been doing. So if you are seen as a respectable pillar of the community, and now that you're actually seen as a tax evader, then that's it. The revenue will make you bankrupt. They've got a duty to make sure they try and get the income back. But the worst scenario is you could go to jail. Do you really want to consider going into a tax avoidance scheme? Forget evasion, because you shouldn't be doing that anyway. That's bad enough, but avoidance has also got major issues. Now, what HMRC kindly did was they gave us a definition of what is acceptable tax planning. And it's a bit dull. Tax planning, using tax reliefs for the purpose for which they were intended. And that's not seen as tax avoidance. But what it does include: claim and release for capital investments, so VCTs, EIS, using your CGT exemption, ISAs, pensions, discounted gift, loan trusts, and so on, investment bonds. And these are just a few examples. That's your armoury. Dull and boring as it is, it works. And that's the key message, is for all these people that encourage for all these big, costly schemes, you actually have the ones that work. The question is to get people into these early enough so that they can maximise the benefit from them when their earnings really do start to rocket. And I'm one of these people that said, well, what's the point of an ISA when you've got a CGT exemption, fairly high CGT exemption, dividend allowance when it was £5,000. But the problem is, once your portfolio starts to reach a certain level and the government take your dividend allowance down to suddenly £2,000, if you had it in an ISA, it wouldn't be taxable. So to try and then drip feed it then takes time. So you should always encourage your clients to maximise the use of the tax wrappers wherever they can and do it as early as possible. So I've slightly overrun. We are having questions afterwards. I hope you found that beneficial, and thank you very much for your time.